Welcome everyone to our second discussion on Miguel de Cervantes' Don Quixote. Today, we're going to examine the famous prologue and the first chapter of the book. And maybe what I can do to start out here is there anyone who wants to give their kind of overall thoughts of the prologue? Um, so that we can maybe start with some grounding. Yeah. Tudor?
I think so, specifically around the author's prologue.
Yes.
Um, I think what stands out for me, it feels in a sense like um, he's deterring people from reading the work who would be interested in other things than what he sees the work being made for.
Hmm.
Um, so he's saying like these are all these sources of work you can read if this is what you're looking for, but it's not necessarily what you would find here. What you'd find here is something more than that.
Yeah, yeah. So I think the famous prologue. Strangely enough, it's not often translated into English, and I'm not sure why. But usually in Spanish editions, they've got this. There's this very lengthy prologue in which Don Quixote, Miguel de Cervantes, is sort of describing his process of writing the prologue as his prologue. He's basically saying that he didn't want to write the prologue.
Mm.
But in the whole process in which he's explaining why he doesn't want to write the prologue, he ends up writing the prologue. And I'm going to share here the Spanish version, and I want to try find the English version as well, because because as I said, it's not that easy to find on online actually in English. But here's the Spanish, and I will provide translations where necessary or where useful. Um, well, before I make any comments on it, Kia, your thoughts on the prologue? Did you manage to read the prologue? Were you able to even able to find an edition with the prologue? Pardon, I think you are muted.
Yeah, sorry, I was just trying to unmute. I think the English version you sent me had a prologue, but I'm actually just checking now if I have read it. But yeah, I don't really have comments yet. I think I want to just see where the discussion goes first.
No, awesome, awesome.
That's fine.
Anything you want to say, Lesedi? Then maybe I'll give a synopsis of the prologue, and we can start discussing it because what this prologue, one of the really important things of this prologue is that it delves into a lot of the themes that are going to come up for the rest of the work. Go ahead, Lesedi.
So I'd say I don't have a comment on the prologue per se. I just have a couple interesting takes or thoughts or
Yeah,
maybe questions for the first chapter. So prologue, nothing I'd say, but first chapter, like there's a lot there that happened that I was just like, what the hell is going on here?
cool. No, then I'm looking forward to that. That sounds. I always like to hear what people think of that first chapter because it's like it contains so much of the book. In fact, the prologue and the first chapter are key to understanding everything that comes up. So, what if I were to kind of summarize what's going on in this prologue? Um, Cervantes is describing how usually in books of this sort there's a prologue, and it's unclear what he actually thinks the genre of Don Quixote is. We discussed that actually in our first session about how he isn't clearly writing a chivalric romance of the sort that was popular just before his time, and he's not really writing a work of history per se, but he insists that his work is actually an historical work, um, and you can even see here he calls it. ¿Qué podía engendrar el esteril y mal cultivado ingenio mío, sino la historia de un hijo seco, avellanado, antojadizo y lleno de pensamientos varios? Without translating the whole thing, he calls this work a history. So what he's writing is how he basically doesn't know how he's going to write this history, write the correct kind of prologue to this history, and he doesn't know how he's going to. He's particularly concerned about uh, including sources for all of his information, which is an indication that he is writing, that he's thinking of his work more as a work of history than as a work of what we would today call a novel. And so basically, as he describes his relation to this work he's just written, a friend of his um, barges into the room, into his office, and asks Cervantes, "Well, what's going on?" And Cervantes answers, "Well, I've written this book, but I don't know how to put all of the front matter in." And so there's this deliberately ironic and ridiculous tone to this, because the principal part of the work is done, but he's being held up. It's almost as though he provides more. He dedicates more importance to something that we, and even in his own time, would not be considered particularly pivotal. He's putting the cart before the horse, um, in literary terms. And then his friend basically says, I want to find the actual line here, and I'm going to give a really rough, awful Spanish English translation. But here he says, por Dios, hermano, que ahora me acabo de desengañar de un engaño en que he estado todo el mucho tiempo en que os conozco, en el cual siempre os he tenido por discreto y prudente en todas vuestras acciones. And what he's basically saying is, by God, brother, I finally, what would the word, I finally awoken from a deceit in which I've been all the time since I've known you, being that I considered you to be a discreet and prudent man in all your actions. And so the friend is basically saying, I thought you were really intelligent beforehand, and now clearly that's not the case. Because any intelligent person would just make up the sources and would just would kind of claim to have read Aristotle and just put Aristotle, cite someplace generally in which Aristotle may more or less have mentioned something that's related to what we're talking about. I think as students who've written humanities essays, we've probably all been guilty of that once or twice. Where you kind of find a journal article that kind of might possibly be talking about what you're trying to discuss, and you just cite it and hope that the lecturer is not going to dig deep and verify. So this is kind of interesting. Well, this is very interesting because, of course, one of the themes that this prologue touches upon is authority. And it's the problems of authority and reliability were at the forefront of writers' minds in this era. It's not too much of an exaggeration. If we now try to ground ourselves in history, it's not too much of an exaggeration to say that Miguel de Cervantes is writing at a time in which the world was decomposing. In a certain sense, he was writing at the breaking of the world. We today consider this to be the early modern era in which the world transitioned from the Middle Ages into the modern period. And we kind of often we look at that in a very prosaic sense. We don't kind of understand often the enormous upheaval. So three massive upheavals that occurred at this time, and they had enormous consequences, were the Protestant Reformation. So this movement initiated by Martin Luther in 1519, I believe it was. I think a little bit earlier, maybe even as early as 1507. I can't remember exactly the date. But when he famously hammers his 95 Theses to the cathedral door of Wittenberg, and that starts this whole process in which particularly the Northern European countries break away from the Catholic Church, and they form a variety of fragmented Protestant churches, which of course largely remain in the Anglo-Germanic world today, right? So in that sense, we're seeing a complete questioning of authority, questioning of an authority that was largely accepted as the criterion for truth before Luther. So and of course that touches upon theology, right? So that touches upon the very the very basis upon which people judged matters as being true or false. Then, of course, you have the scientific revolution, the Copernican revolution of the heliocentric system, which I think we'll discuss a little bit more in future, because it's actually it's got some really interesting epistemological it's got some very interesting epistemological so what would the word be? Some interesting sort of epistemological uh, consequences that Cervantes is actually directly engaging with. And then I think maybe the third big change is the age of discovery is beginning, the age of exploration is beginning, and so the known world itself is expanding enormously. So there's this complete a number of historians have seen this almost as the death of an old world. And tied within that is this question of, if we all believed prior to the Copernican revolution, right, prior to the heliocentric system, if we all believed in the kind of Aristotelian scientific method, um, and now suddenly all these sophisticated mathematical models are demonstrating that it's highly likely that the sun is actually at the center of the solar system, then how can we trust in Aristotle anymore? And to give context here, in the Middle Ages, all teaching, the famous scholastic system of university education, was all based on Aristotle. And so this whole near 1,000-year period of, okay, maybe it's an exaggeration to say 1,000-year period, but if we include Plato and Aristotle, about a 1,000-year period of intellectual tradition is now being questioned by events that maybe occurred 50, 60 years ago. So who to actually trust in is a big problem there. And then maybe the fourth revolution we can talk about that's occurring at this time is the printing revolution. So in the mid 1400s, Johannes Gutenberg famously prints the Bible, and now suddenly books are flooding markets. And whereas in the past the number of books that were printed were sort of, intellectuals could have a very careful control and understanding of all the books that were published, and they could fairly easily discern whether or not the information being published was reliable. But in by the time that Miguel de Cervantes is writing, the printing revolution had taken on such force that early modern readers were facing challenges quite similar to what we've faced in the last few, let's say the last decade, with the explosion of online platforms for publication, and then the fake news hysteria, right? So there is a point, there is an element here in which Miguel de Cervantes is commenting on and referring to this whole crisis of authority. So he's playing a bit of a game. He's saying, well, no one really reads, no one really digs deep into what we're writing. And his friend is saying, therefore, you can actually just write whatever you want, pretend that Aristotle actually said these things, and just cite his ethics at the bottom. And in fact, here you can even see, um, veo que están otros libros. I see that there are other books, aunque sean fabulosos y profanos, tan llenos de sentencias de Aristóteles, de Platón y de toda la caterva de filósofos, etc., etc. And what he's basically saying is, I see that there are other books, although they may be fictional and profane, that are so full with sentences from Aristotle, from Plato, and the whole coterie of philosophers, that readers admire them and consider that their authors are well-read men, are well-read, erudite, and eloquent men. So that's actually one really interesting element about this prologue, the questioning of authority, the problem that clearly we need authority to discern and to help us understand how reliable our what we read is, but that authority isn't actually easy to prove. So I've actually said quite a lot there. I don't know if you guys have any comments about that.
I think for me, what's quite interesting is that through challenging this notion of authority, in a way, and he does it in a sort of in a sense of similar to pretending to be a fool, to be saying, I don't know all these things that these people claim to know. It gives him a sense of authority, right? Indirectly, at least from my perspective as a reader, you see sort of this honesty in terms of what he perceives as is being done, and then that makes you understand the point where the novel is coming from. That it's
Yeah,
coming from a man who's in the world, who sees this authority, but at the same time challenges it. And I think it ties into that idea of history that you spoke of now, in that in terms of the written text, right? The written text is an authority of history of what happened, but it isn't an objective text, right? It's a subjective text written by people who perceive things. And in a way, he's challenging that. And I think it sort of forefronts what he does in the novel. In my perception, is that it doesn't matter if it's necessarily true or not, but what is the truth in it?
yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think that's interesting because there's a lot of what what's happening at the same time. Contemporaries of Cervantes would have been very aware of waves of skepticism, what's known as the crise pyrrhonienne, the Pyrrhonian crisis, which is refers to, I don't want to go too far into this, but of course it refers to the fact that a whole series of skeptical texts, classical skeptical texts, had recently been rediscovered and readopted. And that sparked a wave of skeptical thought across Europe. Interestingly enough, not too strong in Spain. And there's this ongoing question as to whether whether Cervantes himself was actually a skeptic or not. Some have argued that he was likely a skeptic. And of course, it's important to understand that when we talk about skepticism in Cervantes' time, it's not the kind of skepticism that we are accustomed to. The kind of skepticism we're accustomed to today would be like a sort of material skepticism. That's typically a skepticism that would be employed against religious dogmatism, right? It's not so much the case in the time of Cervantes. In the time of Cervantes, skepticism was being used by Catholics. Skepticism was being used by Protestants, particularly in France. My personal conclusion is I think it's highly unlikely Cervantes himself was actually a skeptic. And I think if we look carefully, nor was he a rebel in any sense. I think he didn't have any desire to sort of challenge authority in a kind of post-French revolutionary way. But he was certainly aware of some very concerning, uh, the concerning implications when authorities are not clearly set, and when every man has almost the same degree of authority as anyone else of the same class. So maybe if we were to go back to history and as an illustrative point, what it was also happening at the same time was that because Spain was at war with France, on and off with France, England, and the Netherlands, so three rising powers all at the same time. Spain was a lot of propaganda was being written against Spain. Okay, and also an important thing is that one of the centers of the publishing revolution, the printing revolution at this time was actually in the Netherlands. So a lot of what was believed about history, about Spanish history at the time, was actually written by Spain's enemies and published in a whole series of pamphlets. And so Cervantes, we don't know if he never explicitly references this, but I think if we read carefully and we know the context, we can see that he's reacting to this. And we also know that some of his contemporaries, like Francisco de Quevedo, were explicitly aware of this phenomenon, that Spanish history was being told in a way that was deliberately unfavorable towards Spain. This is particularly the case in the Netherlands, where William of Orange uh, generates these exaggerated tracts about the Spanish Inquisition, um, exaggerated reports about Spanish conquering of the Aztecs and the Incas in order to tell people in the Netherlands, well, if we don't overthrow Philip II, the same thing is going to happen to us. And so Spain itself was, in many ways, the object of was found itself at the center of this whole question of, can you trust what you're reading? And I think Cervantes finds himself in this interesting position. So he can either become a total skeptic, and he can either say, don't believe anything you're reading, or he can become credulous. And we can maybe talk about the dynamics of credulity later, because that's also an important thing. Because one of the really important things that the printing revolution and the wave of skepticism revealed was how credulous people had been of written texts beforehand. Again, there's maybe a bit too much to discuss here, because this is very interesting, but basically, some generations prior to Cervantes himself, there were these texts about Spanish history that were believed by almost any educated person, and then it was revealed by using humanist analytical methods, that philological methods, that these texts were complete forgeries. And so, again, something that people had placed their trust in, a historical document people had placed their trust in, was proven not simply to be, as you were mentioning, Tudor, limited by perspective. It was actually proven to be like complete fabrication. And there's actually a lot of historical fabrication in this era, as different political enemies are trying to like completely discredit each other. So that's what I'll limit my comment to. It's a very incomplete comment, but I don't know. I see Kia nodding and writing away there. I don't know if you have anything that you'd like to add there.
I don't think like anything, I don't know, maybe something a bit obvious, but I do think like this talk about like epistemic skepticism in relation to this character that goes mad from reading. I just like, it's just interesting, because I think like you're struck by that immediately, because we have like so much trust and so like high praise now of people who read a lot, and then you have this character who's just so foolish and is said to be mad from reading. So I think like yeah, I don't know. I think it is interesting, and to see it tied together so well is quite, yeah.
Yeah,
Don't know if there's
exactly. So
anything
we will. I think your observation is absolutely brilliant, because we'll get there. We'll get there soon. But when we talk about Sancho Panza, but there's also a good reason. There's a good reason to believe that Don Quixote himself is actually an image of Platonic thought. If you think about him, he's got all these ideals, he's got these dreams, he lives almost in a realm of forms, and he's always concerned with the abstract, whereas his friend Sancho Panza is always earthly. He's thinking about food. He's also short, so he's closer to the ground, right? He's fat. He's not like this sort of emaciated figure that's far removed from matter like food. And it could be that this is actually a Plato-Aristotle dynamic. And it's very interesting if you think about what Cervantes might be telling us is that Plato and Aristotle must walk together on a journey. That's quite an interesting symbolic reading of it. And I think there's a lot to argue in favor of that. My vision of Cervantes, and I am constantly impressed by him as a writer, is that he's trying to find some way of including everything including all of the movements of thought of his time into some kind of great synthesis that can resolve the great problems of his era. We're going to be talking a lot about Descartes and Montaigne as we go on, because they are also really important here. And there's some indication also that Cervantes is responding to them, at least Montaigne, and his contemporaries, quite directly. But again, we'll have to get there soon, because there's a lot to comment on here. Tudor, you've got anything to say? Maybe any other thoughts about this prologue?
Yeah, I think Kia hit the nail on the head in terms of like what's to come with Don Quixote.
Yeah, no, I'm very glad. I'm actually super grateful to have heard these comments. I'm really keen to see what Lesedi has to say about the opening, because he's quite right. Like it's kind of a crazy start. Maybe I'd like to pick up on I've got two other notes here that I want to discuss. So the first might be, there's this part, I want to go back to the comment that Don Quixote's friend makes where he says, here, this whole thing, by God, I've just, what's going on here? Me acabo de desengañar de un engaño. Desengañar de un engaño. Engaño in Spanish means, does anyone know? Kia, do you remember from your days studying Spanish? Engaño. It's not a very common word.
Yeah, no, sorry.
No problem, because, well, I actually didn't think much about engaño or desengaño before I actually read this, before I did my work on this book for my honors. So, there's this dynamic in not just Don Quixote, but in a lot of the works of the Siglo de Oro. The engaño desengaño dynamic. Engaño means deceit. Desengaño is kind of, I'm trying to think of good English translation for this, but it's sort of the undoing of deceit, revelation in a way. And what early modern Spanish literature is concerned a lot with is encountering some kind of form of deceit, some falsity, and tearing away at that falsity and finding the truth that's lying beneath it. There's a very, very famous Spanish work that I recommend we read, and perhaps after we've done this session, or after we've done this book, we can read Pedro Calderón de la Barca's La vida es sueño, life is a dream, which is all about, which is entirely focused on this process of one falling into deceit and encountering the truth beyond deceit. It's not difficult to see how this applies to what we've discussed so far, right? You read a book, you read a tract, you read a pamphlet. Pamphleteering was kind of the equivalent. I mean, I don't like too much these kind of anachronistic statements like, you know, Mozart was the pop star, the rock star of his era, because, you know, it carries so much of our own cultural baggage back into the past. But maybe you could say that pamphlets, printed pamphlets, were the Twitter of the early modern era. And perhaps by reading these pamphlets, you fall into a certain level of deceit, right? You're deceived in a sense by the apparently obvious truths that the pamphleteer is trying to convince you of. And then as you go further along the process of enlightenment, you engage in the process of desengaño. You are undeceiving yourself. The whole work, by the way, might actually be considered as one in which a man is deceived by what he reads, and through his experiences over time, he overthrows that deceit. If I can give a bit of a spoiler, of course, at the very end, as Tudor will know, at the very end of the work, it at least seems that Don Quixote returns to his senses. And so the work is actually one in which a man who has been deceived comes to the revelation of the truth. So that's a dynamic that we will find ourselves returning to over and over again. Another dynamic that I'm really interested in here is the metaliterary aspect. So we have here Cervantes writing about his well, he's writing a prologue all about how he doesn't want to write a prologue. And by the time that he's described the process of writing the prologue is over. So we're seeing early instances of metaliterary commentary. It's not the first. I mean, it's arguable that you could read the Divine Comedy, for example, as a metaliterary work. But Kia and Tudor, any comments about that?
I think, I don't know, at least when I think about meta literary stuff, I think there's like a invitation to think about the work as something dubitable. So
Yes,
like
interesting. Yeah.
if you're talking about like being incredulous about epistemology and writing in general than to be questioning yourself right from the beginning in what you're writing, is to kind of invite nuance in reading, I think.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly. And this is also something that's very fashionable at the time. I'd like to bring up an interesting work here. I'm sure many of you are familiar with this painting, especially those of you who did sort of work in the arts, right? It is considered possibly the greatest painting of all time. Las Meninas by Diego Velázquez. Ever seen it before, Kia?
Yeah, I have.
Cool. I want to see if I can get a really nice, perhaps if I go to the Wikipedia version, they'll give me a nice, better display of it. So Las Meninas is a good example of mise en abîme, which is of course this French expression of placing something in an abyss. This kind of almost fractal reflection in which in each detail you see the work of as a whole, but it's also layered all like but the work is also kind of layered and it's constantly reflecting itself. So you can see here one of the interesting things is this painting is by Velázquez and he's actually there painting the painting while in the painting, right? That's kind of one of the major mysteries of it. You've also got these really interesting things where he's we assume that he's placed he's looking directly at the viewer, so it's kind of like Miguel de Cervantes directly addressing the reader, um, and but at the same time that he's doing all of this, in the background he's painting paintings that he's previously painted. Right? These are, well, some think they actually might be paintings by Rubens, but it's certain that some of the paintings in this room he actually painted himself. So there's this kind of like constant fractal, almost it's almost kind of psychedelic in a way, right? Where these same patterns are repeating themselves at different levels of reality. And we're seeing Miguel de Cervantes do kind of the same thing. He's writing a prologue about writing a prologue. And in the whole process of writing that prologue about writing the prologue, he finishes the prologue. Um, and I think this wasn't kind of a clever parlor game that early modern thinkers were engaged in. They were concerned with something existentially important, something that that was related to how we can actually ground our knowledge in certainty. If we just kind of do a very brief overview of one of the primary philosophical concerns at the time, it was trying to find a criterion for truth. And this is always a problem, but it particularly became a problem as the Reformation, so as Luther and then later Calvin claimed that church tradition wasn't actually a criterion for truth. Well, first they started saying current church practice didn't constitute a criterion for truth. You couldn't argue that something was true by saying, well, this is actually practiced in church tradition. Now the problem then is they open up a Pandora's box when they do that, because then the question is, what do you count as a criterion for truth? Many start by saying, well, you can start examining the world through your senses, okay? But then you've got the problem of the Copernican revolution, right? We often simplify this today, right? We read back into the past our modern certainties, but you have to understand that if you are trusting your senses, the Earth is at the center of the planet, right? People who oppose the heliocentric system weren't like kind of these reactionary nutters who are trying to suppress science. They had serious epistemological concerns, because if you say suddenly that the sun is at the center of the Earth, then why do we, if you survey, right, 100 people and you ask them, where do you see the sun rise with your eyes, right? Empirically, how do you observe this phenomenon? They'll say, well, we see it rise in the east and we see it set in the west. And then out of that 100, you've got one guy who's saying, no, I've got this abstract system of mathematics. And if I apply this abstract system of mathematics to my astronomical observations, right, the mathematics just, they're intrinsically a lot more consistent if we place the sun at the center of the Earth. Well, if you're a normal person, you'd consider the 99 are reasonable because they're actually verifying this with their senses. And the one guy who's talking about this system of mathematics that a very tiny percentage of the population actually has access to studying, he's probably the mad guy, right? But but the problem is that over time it was proved that the Copernican system actually was the correct one, right? The mathematics just worked out a lot better with that system. So suddenly you can't trust in your senses as much. Even we even have this study of optics is on vogue at the time, and the way in which we can't we're so easily optically deceived by optical illusions, right? So such as a straw bending in the water, right? It's not actually bending in the water, but it seems, if we observe it just with our eyes, it seems as though it is bending in the water. And it takes actually quite a complex set of theories in physics to actually even describe why the straw looks as though it's bent in the water. So it's evident that you can't trust your senses anymore. And so we have this turn inward, right? So people start saying, well, if we can't trust our senses, then we need to rely on, we've got to find the criterion for truth in our minds, right? The very fact that we're searching for a criterion for truth comes from our minds, and it's a sign that perhaps the answer lies in rational thought. Of course, Luther and Calvin argue that actually the criterion for truth is in Scripture, but even then they can't avoid the turn inwards, because what they have to say is, well, how can you, they have to answer the question that the Catholic apologists then argue, which is that, well, if your criterion for truth lies in Scripture, how can you tell what books are scriptural or not? And so their Catholic opponents would point out that what was considered biblical has changed over the centuries, and it was really the Council of Trent that kind of established the modern consensus on what texts are considered scripture within the Catholic Church. But that was a serious problem for the early reformers, right? If we don't know what even constitutes scripture, how can we say that this particular work we are reading is scriptural? And then the answer they come to is that you have to have some kind of interior conviction, which they considered sort of a movement by the Holy Ghost. But then even then is, how do you distinguish that from madness, right? So there's this continual, we're trying, as people search for certainty, they keep pushing back the criterion for truth, trying to find the most certain basis. And of course, it all winds up with Descartes' very famous cogito ergo sum, where he says, well, I may not know any of these other things, but I do know that I'm actually engaged in a process of thought, and therefore I exist, right? And we can at least start from that basis. Now, I'm not philosophically well versed enough to challenge him on that. I actually find that fairly convincing, but I know that many have not, right? I know that many have actually, if he'd really solved the issue, then we wouldn't be still concerned about it today. So it's just more that I don't fully understand the objections to that. And so I don't think we're going to resolve that now. But my point here is rather that the philosophical context was conducive to this turn inward and to the meta-literary, in which we're actually questioning and thinking about our own processes of thought. It's not, for example, pure coincidence that the origins of investigation into artificial intelligence and whether artificial intelligence is possible, and also a much clearer formation of the problem of consciousness arises at this time. It's very evident in the correspondence between René Descartes and Thomas Hobbes, in which it's very clear that both of them are discussing a topic that today we would classify as the problem of consciousness, and the question of whether artificial intelligence is possible, right? I've said a lot there, and I don't think I've fully explicated what I've said, so I hope it's not confusing. But I don't know if Tudor and Kier, you have any comments there, and then we might want to move, before we get a bit too psychedelic, we might want to move on to the first chapter, because I'm really keen on hearing what Lesedi has to say.
I don't think I have anything to add. I think I mostly just agreed, so.
Cool.
Yeah, I agree as well. I'm curious if Cervantes pops up in Don Quixote,
Ah,
even indirectly.
he does. He does actually. So he does indirectly actually. So this is a bit of a spoiler, but this is part of the brilliance of the work, and it's it's amazing. So Don Quixote was written in two parts. So the part we're reading is part one. That was published in 1604 or 1605. No, I think it was published in 1605 for the first time. And it was very common with chivalric romances, which Don Quixote kind of is. We classify it as a novel today. We had a huge long discussion about, well, what genre Don Quixote actually fits into in our first session. Um, it was very common for the authors to write a first part and assume that later writers would complete it. As a really gross simplification, literature was more collaborative at the time. Okay, so this idea that we have where you'd sit down on your own, that really is evident like in Jane Austen, right? Where people would sit down on their own and they'd kind of read a long form novel that didn't really exist. Society was not fully what we would call a chirographic or a print culture at the time. Uh, Reading was usually a communal activity and was a collaborative activity. Now, what had happened is, so like many authors, like many other authors, Cervantes left Don Quixote unfinished in his first part. And then uh, a writer known as, I can't remember his first name for the life of me, but his surname was Avellaneda. We think it's a pseudonym, actually. So Avellaneda wrote a second part to Don Quixote that was really terrible. It was awful. Um, Even the famous Don Quixote critic today, Roberto González Echevarría, who teaches at Yale, basically said it's in terms of its literary value is exclusively derived from the fact that it was a second part to a good book, and it was commented on and scathingly reviewed by Miguel de Cervantes today. And so Cervantes was he was so sort of incensed by how bad the second part was, by how bad Avellaneda second part was, that he decides to pick up his pen again and finish the second part. And interestingly enough, he only finishes that second part just before his death. So that gives us an indication that his health was in decline. Um, but he just felt like he could not leave Don Quixote to be finished by Avellaneda at all. And of course, what he does is one of the reasons, again, I'm sorry for the spoiler, but one of the reasons Don Quixote dies in the end is that he wants to make sure that no one could ever write such a terrible sequel to his work, because the main character was dead. And fortunately enough, this was at a time when, you know, death in fiction was actually kind of permanent, and you didn't have multiple revivals and parallel universes you know, to keep the streaming services happy, right? So yes. Anyway, the now we're getting to the answer to your question, Tudor. Yeah. So in the second part, people have read the first part of Don Quixote, and they've also read Avellaneda's terrible second part of Don Quixote. And so as Don Quixote and Sancho Panza travel around Spain and they're heading towards Barcelona, they encounter all these people who've read the second part and are like really disappointed that Sancho Panza and Don Quixote don't act like Avellaneda's versions of them. And so yeah, and I think there is a moment, I'm trying to remember, where they have a near brush. They may have a near brush with Miguel de Cervantes himself, or it's heavily implied that Miguel de Cervantes had just preceded them had just stayed before them in one of the castles that they stay in. We'll have to get there. I can't remember exactly, but I'd have to read that part. So yeah, you're right. Like Don Quixote comes as close as one can to actually living in the work of his in this work. That again is like a whole can of worms, because who actually is the narrator of this book is a question that has puzzled analysts since the beginning. I'm always astounded at how deep this work is. Uh, but I think, having said that, I'm going to move. I think we're going to close our discussion of the prologue now, and we can start with chapter one, which we've been waiting for a while. So I'm sorry for uh, perhaps going on a little bit too long with this prologue, but Lesedi, I hand the floor to you. We're going to talk about the opening segment, and I think if you'd like, you may even do us the favor of reading the opening line. I'm just trying to find it here. It's not being too cooperative, this website, so let's wait for it to come up. Now I want first part. Cool. Chapter 1, capítulo 1. Besedi, this first line, do you want to read it for us?
Okay.
From here
Um,
up to here, from en un lugar up to Galgo Corredor.
up to which part?
Galgo
There's
Corredor.
so many comments. Oh,
Yeah.
okay. Okay. En el lugar de la Mancha de cuyo nombre no quiero acortarme. No ha mucho tiempo que vivía un hidalgo de la Anza Astillero, adarga antigua, Rosín, flaco y galgo correr.
Fantástico, gracias. Así empieza Don Quixote de la Mancha. So that's how Don Quixote de la Mancha begins. In a place in La Mancha, whose name I don't want to remember. Not long ago, there lived a man, un hidalgo, a hidalgo, of those with, I can't remember the military terms here, but these are all military items. So maybe we can see how they're translated here. I'm going to be lazy. Here, in a village of La Mancha, the name of which I have no desire to call to mind, there lived not long since one of those gentlemen that keep a lance in the lance rack, an old buckler, a lean hack, and a greyhound for coursing. Now, that gives us some idea of who Don Quixote is. He's an hidalgo. We spoke about last time how an hidalgo was, it's a portmanteau of hijo de algo, son of someone of note. And that meant that usually your ancestors, fairly recent ancestors, so grandparents, great-grandparents, they did something of something that earned them esteem, that earned them kind of almost a rank of lower nobility. This, of course, is at the time, this hidalgo system, if we were to call it that, that arose in the process of the Reconquista, which is this kind of this very broad term to describe the process by which the northern Christian kingdoms held a series of on and off wars against the Caliphate of Cordoba, and then later the Muslim powers that succeeded the Caliphate. And that continues more or less from 711 to 1492. Obviously, if we're talking about a period of about 700 years, what I've just given you is a massive simplification, right? We'll probably have to return to this topic in the future because the line between historiography and literary analysis is porous in any case, and it's particularly porous in this. So we can tell here that some of Don Quixote's recent ancestors had earned themselves renown in this whole process of conquering territories that were held by the Caliphate and the subsequent Muslim powers that had invaded in 711. Another thing I'd like to mention here, this expression de cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme has entered the Spanish lexicon, the lexicon of the average Spanish speaker. It's used when you're talking about something but you don't want to mention it. It's kind of a little bit like in the way that famous line in Harry Potter, that phrase in Harry Potter, "He who shall not be named," has become a term. We can talk about, the event that should not be named, she who should not be named, etc., etc. Kind of in the way that's entered, that's become a phrase for English speakers. De cuyo nombre no quiero acordarme is also something Spaniards use regularly. Before we continue, well, not before we continue, so we can continue. Lesedi, what do you have to say about this first chapter? Do you want to provide us, actually, perhaps you could provide us with a kind of a synopsis of what you remember happens, and then tell us what you found really weird about this.
Okay, so for me, I think initially I'm like, okay, he comes up with the name for himself. That makes sense, right?
Yeah,
That's what he does. That's when he comes up with the name for Don Quixote, which is like, okay, I understand that. And then he kind of also is passionate about romance novels, essentially, which is like, okay, I kind of understand that. And then he makes up a horse and he makes up a love interest. And he, if I'm not mistaken, maybe I'm wrong about this one, but he also makes up like a friend or a sidekick or something like that. And I'm like, I was just like, wait, what the hell? Like he just made up literally everything. And it just made me like it kind of brought credence to the fact how you mentioned that this kind of inspired a lot of works of fiction, because there's so many works of fiction where there's essentially a character like this who, I mean, I guess there's many different ways it's been interpreted, but like some works of fiction interpret it as what's this schizophrenia, like
yeah,
paranoia, like seeing visions. And just recently I was watching a show called The Boys, where one of the
yeah,
characters kind of like sees people, like they're not actually there, they just figments of his imagination. And then eventually it kind of gets exposed and he realizes that they're figments of his imagination. Is caused by a tumor. And of course, it's happened like a lot in literature and stuff like that. So just seeing that, and and normally with these types of things, of course, I don't know the whole book, but normally with these types of things, it's not like blatantly obvious or cut and dry. It's almost like we think, okay, this is real. As much as it can seem fake or whatever, it seems real until like there's a twist at the end, like a Fight Club twist. So it got me off guard. It caught me off guard. Let me rather say that, because it was
yeah.
just like so unexpected.
Yeah, yeah, and I think also that ties into what we've said before. These first sessions are a bit tricky because we have to lay the ground on so many different topics, but it gets easier as we go on because the work is fractal, right? It's constantly referencing itself and it's constantly referencing eternal concerns. And so this goes back to what I was saying about this turn inward. So suddenly we're concerned with the state of the mind. Is Don Quixote mad or isn't he? And if he's mad, well, then he's not in a position to really judge what's true and what isn't. Uh, some people have kind of read as psychological, have kind of tried to analyze what Don Quixote is suffering from psychologically. And some people have said, well, maybe he's schizophrenic, maybe he would be what we would today consider uh, having almost a dual personality disorder. I think those attempts, though interesting in a narrow sense, they're foolhardy because Cervantes is telling us something far more universal than one diagnosable clinical disorder. He's actually telling us something that applies to every single human being. Um, so yeah, this representation of madness, but also almost a kind of benign madness, and the sort of madness that the reader is going to have to interact with constantly, is, I mean, I probably, maybe a year or so from now regret saying this, but it's probably a first in world fiction. People have been portrayed as mad previously, but their madness has been something kind of once off, and it's been something. It's often been like associated with that character being dangerous. I can't bring to mind immediately any instances, but instances of madness in classical, Greek and Roman myth are they're everywhere to be seen. But those people aren't really characters per se. Uh, that kind of in a sense, dynamics that the main character will interact with. So yeah, the idea that you take this phenomenon, the turn inward, the questioning of our own sanity, and you actually put that front and center as the main character is something really interesting. And then the other thing that's really that I noticed only now this time is that there's a Genesis element to this. So um, Don Quixote, coming from a Christian culture, from a Catholic culture, he would have been deeply exposed to and I don't use the word mythology or myth in the sense that it's not true per se, but it's more that mythology in the sense that it's a series of stories that reflect these perennial concerns we have. So he would have been like steeped in biblical lore and biblical mythology. And so it's interesting that in his first chapter, he actually engages in a kind of Genesis story. So I didn't notice this until I read it now, but if you think about it, Don Quixote is inventing himself, man. He invents a woman. Uh, he invents a woman, Dulcinea del Toboso, who of course becomes his love interest, and he also names an animal. So we remember that in Genesis, there's that moment where Adam names all the animals, and that's actually what Don Quixote himself does. So there's this weird sense in which like Don Quixote is kind of like an Adam, but he's also a God figure as well. Um, that's kind of that actually was really interesting. I didn't notice that the first time I read it. So I think that fits into that fits into that fits into a lot of what you were saying there, Lissetti. Tudor and Kia, any comments about this first chapter?
I think for me, what's quite interesting is Don Quixote makes his character makes sense in terms of what's presented, right? In terms
Mhm.
of the Hidalgo and how he's someone who's had a lot from previous generations, and that's what's allowed him to engage in sort of these stories and read books about knights and chivalry, and it's sort of what's allowed him to create this obsession.
Yeah,
And then it's clear to me, okay, this is now Don Quixote, the man who's sort of inventing himself, who's coming up with who he is going to be. I think what's interesting is that in a way he's already had, being an Hidalgo, he's already had the benefits of what would be considered to be like a knight, right?
yeah,
Because he's already gathered them, but because he wasn't the one doing it, he sort of gave up like land and things like that in order to
interesting.
continue reading books about people who do those things. And then he's come to a point where he's decided to do it himself. Um,
Wow.
what I am interested in, and I don't think I quite understood from it, um, for me, it isn't very clear the shift in him, in what prompts him to behave and finally stop necessarily reading books and discussing with people in the town of Mancha who the best knight is and what their merits were,
Yeah,
and what caused him to decide to become that knight. Um, yeah, I think that's where I'm a bit puzzled in the first chapter, but it's yeah.
yeah. I think that's interesting. I've also thought about this a lot. What's the moment that turns Don Quixote mad? Um, we spend very little time uh, with Alonso Quesada. So the assumption is that before he was Don Quixote, he was Alonso Quesada or Quijada. They mention the various names that he could have been. Ah, here. So he might have been Alonso Quijada, Alonso Quesada, or Alonso Quijana. The reason that the narrator doubts that or has various opinions we'll get to later because I don't want to introduce that right now because there's so much to discuss. I do like the point you were making about how he he's an hidalgo and so he's got a certain status that allows him to read. Because if we go back, this is an interesting commentary on, and I'll try keep it brief because I'm sorry, you guys know that I've got this really bad habit of rambling, but it's very difficult to kind of keep concise with something this deep. But the very opening lines of this, and it's a pity that we don't have any of the other Spanish students um, who are interested in this project because I would have liked them to try translate this. The very first line of the book is desocupado lector. Do any of you have an idea what that means? Ocupado in Spanish. If you say estoy ocupado, what does that mean? Tudor?
You're busy.
Exactly. So desocupado,
Yes. So you're, it's almost like free, but
Yeah, exactly.
yeah,
You're not busy. This
you're
is an
not busy. Yeah.
interesting commentary, and I'll try to keep it brief because economic history interests me a lot. But the notion of work that people would have had before the Industrial Revolution and before what an economic historian Jan de Vries has called the Industrious Revolution, which is, well, economic historians are increasingly seeing it as the origin of industrialization, which is this period in the 17th century, the mid 17th century, when for some reason the household became uh, a center of production. There was kind of a marginal utility, marginal benefit in the household engaging, the early modern household in Europe engaging in more production than consumption that spurred this whole transformation in the way that we look at work. Uh, Context today would be something like the average home in in modern 21st century life is a center of of consumption. We basically consume. The average household doesn't actually produce any economic goods, um, by and large. I mean, okay, that's you'd have to clarify that and um, you'd have to qualify that somewhat, right? Because of course human beings grow up in households and they can produce economic goods, but this is actually an anomaly throughout economic history. Prior, the household was kind of a balance between production and consumption. If you think about how women would, we often like play this off as though it's not important, but like women engaging in needlework in pre-modern societies, that was actually something that was economically massively beneficial. Most beer making, I forget the technical term, that was actually done by women as well. So the household for both men and women was a center of production and consumption almost equally. And then in the mid 1600s, there are some economic incentives that actually mean that the household starts becoming more a center of production. And some economic historians trace this all, say that we can trace modern work culture all the way back to this, in which our idea today is kind of that work is the sort of default status of man. There are, interestingly enough, lots of philosophical causes of that during this era. So the Reformation that I mentioned earlier, that plays a huge part in the development of this idea that we have. But for example, we would consider what we're doing right now almost as recreation. But for people in Cervantes' time, this what we're doing right now would actually be kind of the most important thing you can do, and it would be what you're meant to do as a human being. Um, they would use the term that we translate now as leisure. Unfortunately, that's got kind of a, partially because of the work culture we have, that's got kind of a negative connotation. If someone is engaging in leisurely activities, we associate that with like laziness or indigence, right? Um, but not so the case in the past. Like in early modern and medieval and classical societies, uh, work was something that you had to do in order to engage in leisure, in order to get back to leisure. So they kind of maybe had our priorities and our defaults switched, if you want to simplify it that way. The etymological examples of this are really interesting. The word for recreation in Spanish is ocio, and the word for work or a business is negocio. This comes from the Latin otium and negotium. So negotiation comes from the Latin word for the absence of leisure. Otium was what you were supposed to have, leisure. Work, negotium, the absence of leisure, was kind of like it was a lack of something as opposed to something that was like constitutively a thing per se. Um, that was the way that they would see work. A good example that we have in Greek, the word for work is askolia, which is the negation of the Greek word skolia, which we get school from, right? Because even though it's not, we all know it's not the case. School should actually be a place of leisure in which you kind of engage in cultivation of the mind, right? Or cultivation of the person and culture, essentially. So that's actually a really interesting thing. It's not, I'm not mentioning that just as kind of a historical curiosity, but rather that we get kind of an idea of what Don Quixote, of what Cervantes thinks about readers in general, and who the reader should be and what the reader should be like. Uh, I think he wants a reader who is going to have the leisure to pay attention to the perennial issues that he's raising in this book. And at the same time that he does that, he also points out the kind of the other side of the coin, the danger of like being a leisurely person, being a man of leisure, is that you can become so divorced from reality that you start to believe that what you're reading is real, is like not fictional. Kier, do you have any comment about that? I think you are on mute.
I was a little bit alarmed initially by this idea of him actually creating the characters, because I think in the next chapter he rides to a bar on a horse. So if this horse is actually fictional, I'm a bit concerned to how insane
Oh,
he is.
yeah,
So
no,
I just wanted to clarify, like, is he giving characters names, or is he actually inventing them?
he's giving characters names. Yeah, so he's not. So
Okay.
Rocinante, his horse, did exist beforehand. But
Okay.
actually, even the name is kind of a pun. Rocin means workhorse. Ante in Spanish, antes now means before. So the name Rocinante means he was a workhorse beforehand.
Yeah.
Um,
Okay. That was kind of my follow-up question, is like, obviously with his name it's kind of humorous. And I think with his lover who's somewhere and doesn't know that he actually exists, I think Dulcinea means sweetheart, but
yeah.
Toboso,
I
where, like,
actually
is there significance or irony in that?
I actually don't know. I'm sure there is, but I wouldn't. I'd have
Okay.
to actually do some research there. There are huge gaps in my knowledge on this book. Even though I actually wrote a thesis on it, it's not, uh,
Mm.
as we know, you can't really. You can only analyze it on through a tiny lens. So yeah, I'm sure there's a pun there. We'll have to look it up in future. There's also a pun to his own name, which is Don Quixote. So Don is obviously a noble title. Quixote,
Mhm.
that ending ote is like an augmentative. It makes something big look, it makes something bigger look grosser, look less refined and sophisticated. So there's this sort of, even within his own name, we see this kind of, not duplicity, but rather this kind of oxymoron, right? That reflects who he actually is. And De La Mancha plays this one further. La Mancha in Spain, La Mancha in Spain, I mean, it still exists, and there's a University of La Mancha now. And there's even like it's a bit garish, but there's a theme park to celebrating Don Quixote and Sancho Panza there. The place is like, it's really, at this stage, would have been like a barren, dry wasteland. Castile, which is the kingdom that this is set in, of course, at the time, Spain is really sort of a united kingdom before the United Kingdom, where there are a variety of different kingdoms that are unified under one crown and under one person. Um, in terms of its weather, it's actually a lot like the Highveld here in Gauteng, and so if we think about like kind of a dry, grassy field, it's not like in the beautiful green rolling hills that you'd see in England or Ireland. It's not actually really the place that that heroic figure is supposed to come from. It's not the place that we'd associate with King Arthur. Uh, it's that's the kind of place that Don Quixote comes from. So he's this noble knight from. It might be a little bit like kind of talking, and I mean this in all with all due respect to the place, but it's a little bit like talking about a hero in South Africa hailing from Kempton Park. It's a little bit like that sort of. It's that kind of out of the way. It's not somewhere you would think of. It's not a political capital
Hmm.
or a place of particular previous cultural importance. Um, yeah, if we have any Kempton Park patriots, I do apologize, but it's the best parallel that came to my mind at that moment. Um, yeah, sorry, but anything else you wanted to say, Kia?
I think it's just with that clarification in mind. I think it is just interesting to think about how his reality kind of comes from reading books, and in books the authors get to name the characters, and they get to like decide how the story goes, and this is kind of what he's doing. He's like playing the author in that he's like naming himself, and he's naming the horse, and he's naming this lady, and they all get to highlight his own meaning. So he's kind of made himself a character,
Yeah. Yeah.
like an author, which is kind of the unreality again.
Exactly. Exactly. Lesedi, anything else that you want to comment about this?
Sorry. Yeah, I think um I was quite shocked. That's the main thing for me. Like the main thing was shock. And I think the fact that you just mentioned that the horse actually did exist, it kind of makes it feel more like a um what's this? More like a Fight Club. Although of course
Hmm.
Tyler didn't exist per se, he still technically did exist. It's just that we experienced him in a different way. So I'm excited to see how that twist kind of turns up in the book.
Yeah. Yeah, we'll go further about this sort of invention of oneself and invention of other characters as we go on. Um, it's actually not an easy chapter to read. It's one of the more difficult chapters to read. There's so much that I still want to mention about it, but I think maybe what I'll do here is I'll look at some of my the comments, the notes that I've written about here. Uh, the one thing that we've commented on already is what's the origin of Don Quixote's madness? We don't know when that moment is that he like clicks and he actually goes mad. What they do mention though is I'm trying to find the actual line, but it says, I can remember it's se le secó el cerebro, which means his brain dried out literally. So this is a clear indication that uh, that Cervantes is looking at this according to the current medical, here it is, the contemporary medical theories, that of the humor. So there was this idea, for context, that all illnesses, well, all human beings had these sort of four humors, which were kind of, I don't know if they would have thought it was kind of like a liquid or a viscous kind of thing. I don't know, Kia. I know that you mentioned this actually before once when we were having a discussion, uh, but I'm not sure like what the humors were like physically, what they would have thought the humors were physically. But there are these sort of four essences in the body, and I think they are, I think it's bile, black
Mm.
bile, phlegm, and I
Is
can't
it
remember.
blood?
Was it blood? Yeah, is it blood?
I did think the humans were liquid. You could also just look it up.
Yes, please, if you could do that for me. But yeah, so there was this idea that like you have these four humors, and then what you need to do is you need to keep them in balance. Uh, and if your humors are imbalanced, that will lead to illness.
Yeah, so
Now,
it's, sorry,
yeah,
it's black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood.
black bile, yellow bile, phlegm, and blood. Yeah. So that are these. So this idea is that if in your like bloodstream and if in your body in general, you don't keep these humors in balance and in harmony, then you're going to get ill, and that can explain mental illnesses and physical illnesses as well. And it said here somewhere, I can't remember, that his brain dries out. So I'm not sure what that would mean, but it means essentially, I'm not sure exactly what what humor he would be lacking or have a deficiency in, but it was commonly believed that if you had a deficiency of one of these humors, like it affected your like almost like your neural plasticity in a way, or it affected your I mean, kind of it would be like the equivalent to what we would see today happen when people are on extremely low fat, low oil diets, and they're in a sense their neurons aren't firing properly because they're like deprived of the oils that they need. Um, so that's that's kind of a physical explanation, but I don't think when we're dealing with Miguel de Cervantes, I think we have to look a bit further than kind of the material explanation. He's probably got there's probably a whole constellation of causes to Don Quixote's madness, and so we discussed that a little bit before. My next point that I want to make is maybe maybe this can be kind of our last point, unless you guys have something really interesting to say that you're burning to get out. Uh, the idea that who who the author of the work is. I'd like to introduce that because that's going to become seriously important as we get on in this work. And fortunately enough, it's already in the first part that we address this issue. And if we look back, we've got some precedent to discuss this. Cervantes refers to himself in his prologue both as the father of this work, right? So both as the father of this work and as the stepfather of this work. And it's difficult to know what to make of that. So look, we know historically Cervantes wrote Don Quixote, right? And we know that he basically, in the process, by that mysterious process by which most great writers and great artists kind of seem to absorb a lot of the tradition that they're in contact with and then reproduce it in a new way. He wrote this work as individually as any other artist individually writes composes their work, right? But he refers to himself both as the father in like the conventional sense of generating this work on his own, but also the stepfather, which indicates that someone else has created this work and now he's taking custody of it. And he's kind of guiding it towards its end. And without confusing you guys too much, there are at least 4 different narrators of Don Quixote. So there is Miguel de Cervantes, and what Miguel de Cervantes claims he's doing is that he's collating and collecting together the historical works of an Arab scholar named Cide Hamete Benengeli. We'll only meet him like much later in this work. And that even Cide Hamete Benengeli, that then Cide Hamete Benengeli himself relied on other sources in order to collect his information, and that then even beyond there, there's this mysterious unnamed narrator who's actually writing the book, and that Cervantes is just the one who's like collecting all this written material together in an edition, like the way that someone might collect an anthology today. That is a really interesting question because that actually explains why that explains the uncertainty behind Alonso Quijada's real name. We saw that there are at least 3 possible different names names of Alonso Quijada. So everything you read here, even this text, so perhaps not this. This might have been like if we were to adopt Cervantes' metafiction for a moment, this would have been written by Miguel de Cervantes, but according to the way he wants to make us, what he wants us to believe, all this text here, basically from here, with a few exceptions up until the end of the book, is narrated by some guy we don't know, who himself is collating all of Cide Hamete Benengeli's historical works, who himself had to rely on primary resources. So we can go back here, Cervantes is doing this. He's engaging in this Siglo de Oro style, mise en abîme, meta-literary fractal kind of project here. That's perhaps my final comment. You guys, do you have anything that you want to say? Tudor, maybe we can start with you.
I'm just looking forward to it, to seeing it, and yeah, it will be interesting. I didn't realize there were so many narrators.
Yeah.
But
Yeah, I'm only saying that now, so that you guys can prepare yourselves because
yes,
it's actually a lot of work to try and figure this out after you've read the whole work,
yes.
and after you've read a lot of the commentaries on it. Kia?
I mean, I thought this book was deep prior to coming here, but I think you've really brought it to life in
Yeah.
a more expansive way. So thanks for that. And then, I'm also
Thanks.
looking forward to it. There was something else, but it's okay.
No, please mention the other thing. Please go ahead.
Oh, I mean, in other words, I forgot what I wanted to say.
Oh, okay. Okay. No, that's cool. No, well, you're welcome. I'm glad that you enjoyed it so far, and I'm glad that you found the presentation useful. Lesedi, anything you want to claim to say? Sorry.
I think I've covered most of how I felt about the book. I guess maybe to just sum it up is shock and excitement. So I'm looking
Yeah.
forward to see how it comes out.
Shock and excitement. I think that's a great way of approaching this book. I've got a bit of a bias, and I think it's sort of like a lot of our biases. It's 50% rational, 50% just personality. But I struggle with modern art in general, and well, maybe a part of that is just sort of an aesthetic, personal, private kind of thing. Uh, a part of it is grounded in the fact that if you have something that people have been commenting on for 400 years, 500 years, and it's remained at the forefront of our attention for that long, it's probably because there's something perennial that this work is addressing. And I always, when I read a modern work, I sometimes think like, will people 100 and 200 years from now still be reading this? And I can't answer that question ever, right? But it's a useful kind of exercise to carry with you, uh, because I've never come across a work, like a great work that's written about 4 centuries ago or prior, that isn't so overwhelmingly deep that it's actually a little bit difficult to address. And you almost don't know where to start and you don't know where to stop. And there's such cognitive overload that it's tricky to even you approach it with shock and excitement, as Lissetti is said. So guys, unless you have any other comments, I'm going to sign off now, and we will perhaps, I think it makes more sense for us to contain our conversation in future, and try get through a little bit less, but maybe more regularly. So we'll discuss our schedule. This will partially depend on some of the other group members. I'm going to stop the recording now, and we will discuss how we move forward with this book in the future. Thank you very much, everyone, for coming, and I hope you and yes, and thank you to to everyone for who tuned in and listened to this episode. And I will say hasta la próxima.